So, this week in the Sacred Gathering, we will begin our journey through Mark that will be in through at least the first part of the summer. So, just quick kind of note about my method here. I recognize the book of Mark is incredibly dense. You can spend a ton of time on every single story, and it'll take you, months and years to really tease out how much is going on with Mark. I'm going to do kind of more of a quick overview style. We are going to do 1 to 2 chapters every week. I will probably mention some of the other things going on in those bigger chapters and then pull out a little section that I think God might have us um, learn from. So this week we're looking at chapters 1 and 2, but the story I'm going to pull out comes right at the end of chapter 1, so right kind of in the middle of that, and I think it exemplifies a lot of things that the book of Mark early on is doing. So let's jump in. So chapter 1 just starts with a bang. First thing we get as an introduction to John the Baptist, this wild man shows up in the wilderness, starts telling people that something is coming. We meet Jesus. He's baptized by John. The Spirit comes on him. He goes out and is tempted in the wilderness. And then the next thing we know about him, he's kind of following up the movement after John is gone. He's gathering some disciples for himself, and then he starts teaching. He starts teaching a very kind of unique and distinctive thing. Whereas John said, "Hey, something's coming," Jesus says, "The kingdom of God is here." And then the rest of the chapter, Mark, I think in a lot of ways, is descriptions of what that actually means in Jesus' mind. And it's not a lot of talk about doctrine, it's not a lot of thinking. It is showing God's powerful presence over various things. So we first have these stories where Jesus is challenging the spiritual enemy, where he is exercising and casting demons out of people. I think one of the things that we're supposed to learn about the kingdom of God is it's not unopposed. There are spiritual powers of darkness. There is darkness within people. There are darkness within systems in the world, right? And this will be an ongoing theme of the Gospel of Mark, that the kingdom of God, God's way of doing things, is not going to be unopposed, but God is more powerful. God is more powerful than the demons. And so Jesus shows that this oppression of people by the demonic, that this opposition by the other side spiritually, is something he can handle. He is more powerful. The next thing that we're going to see is a series of healings, which begins with one of his disciples, Peter's mother-in-law. He shows that he has power over physical sickness, that he has power over physical decay in many ways, right? That sickness and disease and hurt and harm are in fact not part of the kingdom of God. Jesus desires wholeness for people, and disease and sickness are going to be a major part of what gets in the way of that for many people's lives, right? And so the kingdom of God is about physicality. It is about our physical healing as well as being about showing power over demons, etc. And then the third example that we're going to look at, again, this idea of restoring and wholeness, is going to be over, yes, this story we're going to look at of Jesus cleansing a leper. It includes the physical healing, right? He's being cleansed of a physical disease, but that disease has also set him apart. He is also socially an outcast now because people are afraid of getting the disease. But leprosy also has a religious, a spiritual connotation, because he's not just sick, he is also unclean. And so all three of those are wrapped up in this healing that God through Jesus and the kingdom is about restoring the outcast and the outsider. It is about making the unclean clean. It is about physical healing as well. So these kind of intertwining themes of wholeness being restored in any aspect it can shows up very strongly in this story. So let me read real quickly, end of Mark chapter 1, verse 40. And a leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling said to him, "If you will, you can make me clean." Deeply moved, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said, "I will, be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus sternly charged him and sent him out away, saying, See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them. But he went out and began to talk freely about it, and to spread the news, so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but was out in the desolate places, and people were coming to him from every quarter. So, a couple of kind of quick things about leprosy. As I said, in the society at that time, it had both kind of the physical disease aspect, it had a religious, spiritual aspect of uncleanliness, and these together are socially going to make this person an outcast. At the time, people were expected to live alone away from society, and anytime they were in public spaces, they were expected to keep their distance and even yell out as they're walking, I am a leper, I am a leper, right, to keep other people away from them. You can't help but see with this man that his disease is becoming his identity. He is not a person who has leprosy, he is a leper, right? And so even the conversation is something he shouldn't be doing. He's so desperate. He is willing to go and break all these codes to have a conversation with Jesus, even though he's supposed to be keeping his distance. And the fact that Jesus is okay with this, welcomes this alone, that he's willing to risk being tainted by that which is gross in every sense of the word, right? Says something about his heart, says something about how deeply he knows both his own power, but also his ability to look beyond the ways that other people might hesitate, the ways other people might be afraid, because he desires the kingdom and this wholeness so strongly. It's also interesting that this man is the first time of all these healings and things we get this kind of new theme introduced, and that's that of faith, right? He is expressing the fact he trusts and believes that God can do something through Jesus. Actually, I think I misspoke, because the difference here is the man shows that he has faith. He believes Jesus can heal him, right? If you will. But he isn't at the point where he trusts yet. He doesn't know Jesus' heart. In some ways, he doesn't know God's heart because of that. He thinks God can heal him and restore him from this, but he doesn't necessarily believe that he wants to or desires to. And so Jesus' reaction is very interesting and telling of building that trust, the fact that God can be trusted, that Jesus can be trusted. So there's a bit of a textual problem with this one. I read it, what was it? It's, and deeply moved. You see in a lot of translations, you see moved with pity. Sometimes you see moved by anger, or sometimes the more vague, deeply moved that I use. There's two words here that are both fairly well attested in the documents we have of Mark. And one is, yes, has to do with pity and deep movement. The other has to do with anger and frustration. Also, deep movement. They're both very strongly felt words. And so, there's some people say, well, obviously, Jesus feels sorry for this man. He has pity for him. Although I think the earlier reading and some other things I read make it seem like the anger is actually probably the preferred. That might have been the original, and it was moved to pity to kind of, clean up the fact that why would this make Jesus angry? And I think the reason that it makes Jesus angry is he sees the situation this man is in. He sees how isolated it is, how physically miserable he is, how he's starting to see himself as someone who's unclean. And we get this a couple of times in the gospel. This is not an abstract problem for Jesus. He takes it very personally. He sees pain. He sees, he sees death in the case of Lazarus in the Gospel of John. He sees the things that are wrong in the world, and they make him angry. They piss him off, right? He wants to heal. He wants to restore the world. And both words, whichever one we prefer, they are deeply felt. This is not something, Jesus does not take his mission kind of offhandedly. He's not, oh yeah, we're going to restore all things. It's a very different portrait than I think sometimes we're used to seeing of this kind of calm, peaceful Jesus. He's mad at the brokenness he sees in people. He's mad at the brokenness in the world. And as we're going to see very quickly, he's mad at religious people because they are not addressing that and helping out in the way God desires them. They are not restoring. They are not bringing the kingdom. So Jesus feels this man's plight deeply, and he decides to do something about it. And the first thing that he does is fascinating because he breaks good religious law. He reaches out and touches this man, right? This is a person who's isolated, who's probably not been touched. The one thing he's most certainly not getting is human contact. He reaches out and he touches him. And according to ritual law, of course, this means Jesus is then unclean. And yet we're told very specifically he was both healed and he was made clean. His physical disease is gone, and in the religious, spiritual aspect, he has been cleaned. He is no longer unclean, which gives us this fascinating kind of glimpse into the power of Jesus here. He is not made unclean by contact with the way the rest of us would be. His cleanliness is so pure and is so inherent to him. He, in fact, touches unclean things and they also become clean. Um, and finally, I think we get this command from Jesus at the end to go to the priest and offer a testimony. This probably has a couple of purposes. One, I think it's for the sake of the man, the leper himself, because according to the law, if someone happened to be healed from leprosy, they had to go and be declared clean again for the sake of the community, right? And so I think, just if you think about the situation, if he's recognized out wandering around, people see him and he's like, "Hey, aren't you that guy with leprosy?" No, 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 I got better. I got better from leprosy, right? Unless he has gone through the official process, are people going to believe that? Are they going to trust him? Or they think he's just kind of covering himself up in some way? And so the full social restoration, there's a ritual for that, and I think he desires him to go and to do that. And then we're also told that Jesus mentions as a testimony to them, as in the priests, as in the establishment. This is a little unclear, a little baffling why that is, but I think it's one of many sly nods Mark and Peter are going to sneak into this gospel. Again, one of the points of the gospel is this growing recognition of who this actually is, who is among them, and what it looks like to follow him. And so at the time, there was apparently kind of a rabbinic saying that said leprosy is up there with death. Only God can heal leprosy or death. In the Old Testament, there's only one one case of someone being healed, and that's the general Naaman, healed from leprosy. And it's worth noting, of course, that Elisha, who's part of that miracle, doesn't touch him, right? The way Jesus does. He stays his distance until he's healed. But this thought was leprosy and death are kind of the two things that only God can heal. And yet here is this man showing up who says, okay, well, who healed you? Well, Jesus healed me. Then who might Jesus be then? It's a sly nod, I think, to the idea that only God can heal leprosy or death. And we're going to see Jesus heal both of those things. In that case, just like the question the disciples will ask later when the storm is calmed by his voice, well, who the heck is this guy then? Right? And I think that's part of the story that's starting to build here. And so the story ends with him, of course, not taking Jesus' advice. He went out, he began to talk freely and spread the news so that Jesus could no longer openly enter a town, but he was out in the desolate places, and people were still coming to him from every quarter. And so the last kind of quick nod we get here is Jesus' willingness to do something even though it costs him, and his willingness to more or less trade places with this guy. This guy used to live out in desolate places. He had to stay away from everyone. And yet now Jesus, because he goes out and spreads the word, he can't go into town anymore. He's just getting mobbed all the time, which is interesting because if he were a normal leader, if he was trying to win fame and influence and start kind of a traditional violent revolution, having great crowds at your disposal is a really good thing, right? And yet Jesus instead chooses isolation. He chooses to take the man's place in the desolate places because he knows that way is not his way. That way is not the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God has been about restoration and wholeness in any sense that can be at this point. And he knows that getting the crowds to follow him will not do that. So he chooses desolation. He chooses to swap places with this man, this outcast, for the sake of his healing. Again, a neat hint of what is going to continue to come. And so, just pulling from the story, I just had a few questions for us to be thinking about. Again, in asking, who is this Messiah and how are we willing to follow? So, the first question I had is, do we in fact trust, not just have faith like this man did at the beginning, right? He trusted God could do something. He had faith God could do something. He didn't yet trust that God desired to do something. And the kingdom of God here is described as one of wholeness, of restoration, of things being made right. I think most of us have faith that that is God's desire. Do we trust that God is in here, in the midst of this mess with us, desiring and working towards wholeness and restoration of all things? What's our reaction to places or people who are broken and messy? Do we have kind of that default human reaction of pulling ourselves away because we're afraid of them tainting us in some way, shape, or form? Or are we like Jesus? Are we willing to have the conversation? Are we willing to reach out and touch and give them what they need, even if it does ultimately cost us something? And finally, are we willing to find ourselves out in desolate places without, the cheering of the crowds? Are we willing to go to places that don't always feel safe, to places that don't always feel like that's where we want to go? Are we willing to join our Master out in the wilderness, out in desolate places for the sake of others? So just some questions for us to be thinking about out of the first couple chapters of Mark.